Thank you all for being here, and thank you to Dr. Walter and Linda Evans. Thank you all so much. Meeting you changed my life, is continuing to change my life, and has taken over my life in a beautiful and joyous, transformative way. So thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to thank all the library staff, Kenny, Dora, Sarah, Robert, Sally, everyone here. Thank you so much for everything. Gordon, Yanis, other people who can't be here. Thank you, all of you, for making it possible and for bringing Mr. Douglass and his family's story back to Scotland. Ask the slave, what is his condition? What is his state of mind? What he thinks of his enslavement, and you will be speaking to the silent dead. There comes no voice from the enslaved. We are left to gather his feelings by imagining what would be our view were our souls in his soul's stead. For Frederick Douglass, the life of an enslaved woman, man, or child was no life at all. David Walker, the founding father of black revolutionary radicalism in the transatlantic world, described it, "How do I say I am living when I am already dead?" Sojourner Truth described it, "I come from another country, the country of the slave." And this question of the other country, the country of the slave, is the question that defined Frederick Douglass's life in freedom and Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey's life in slavery. I feel that we children have shared in a measure your sacrifices for the good of the cause. Frederick Douglass, Jr. The family worked on, only encouraged by the mere thought and the hope that we were working to further the cause in which our mother and our father were interested, namely the emancipation of the slave. Lewis Henry Douglass. We were a happy family working in the cause of the struggle for liberty. Charles Raymond Douglas. The told story of Frederick Douglass is the untold story of the Frederick Douglass family, Rosetta Douglass. As we stand here in 2018 and we understand the respect we must pay to the silent dead, those who live and die in sacrifice and suffering of an unimaginable and unrememberable scale, we stand beside Mr. Douglass's words when he speaks of my bondage and my freedom. No more urgent in 2018 is the cry, our bondage and our freedom. Understanding Mr. Douglass and his revolutionary rhetoric, his revolutionary ideology, and his political manifestos of social and revolutionary change in the context of a collaborative, collective, grassroots freedom struggle. As Mr. Douglass described it himself, he said, right is of no color, creed, sex, or nation. He believed we all use our broken humanity to work in the struggle for freedom. My poor mother, like many other slave women, had many children, but no family. The slave mother can be spared long enough from the field to endure all the bitterness of a mother's anguish when it adds another name to the plantation ledger of the master, but not long enough to receive the joyous rewards afforded the intelligent smiles of her child. I never think of the terrible influence of slavery with my infantile affections, and it's diverting them from their natural course without feelings to which I can give no adequate description. What you're looking at and what you'll be able to see within the doors across from here is the plantation ledger that shows the dates of the births and deaths of Frederick Douglass's family. Frederick Douglass spent his whole life, a man born in Maryland into slavery, looking for this ledger as an old man in freedom, and access was persistently denied. So we have the privilege today of looking at a document he never saw. Frederick Douglass understood this document as an atrocity document, a document of tragedy, a document of devastation, a document of annihilation. What you're looking at here is the recorded, and these are Aaron Anthony, his white slaveholders' words, Negroes' ages as follows, and you see here the genealogy of the Frederick Douglass family. Frederick Douglass Jr., Charles Remond, Lewis Henry, Annie's, their grandfathers, their great-grandmothers, their legacies of those individuals that Mr. Douglass described it. As a child, I sat in the kitchen under the table and I heard words of Africa. I heard words of slave ships that were denied my ancestors. So as you look at this document, you can see as we go through exactly who Douglass memorializes. Douglass talks of his ancestors repeatedly through his whole life. In these Negro ages as follows, as you see it in a big ledger, so you get to see it close up. Frederick Douglass himself recorded 5 daughters of Betts. Millie, daughter of Betts, born January 28, 1790. Harriet, daughter of Betts, born February 22nd, 1792, and you see the pencil marking, dead. Ginny, daughter of Betts, born October 28, 1799. Esther, mispronounced, miswritten Easter, daughter of Betts, born August 1810. And finally, Prissy, who Frederick Douglass always honoured as Priscilla, daughter of Betts, born August 15, 1816. Now, these were the individuals that Douglass knew about. This ledger tells us those he didn't know about. Betts, daughter of Betts, born October 19, 1801. Sarah, daughter of Betts, born February 1804, died 1816. Born 1804, died 1816. Mary Ann, daughter of Betts, born April 27, 1806. And Kate, daughter of Betts, born January 1815, died 1815. Born 1815, died 1815. These memorial lists are white supremacist documents of power. They are only recorded to us. We only have them because they serve the need of the financial greed of white plantation owners. Bodies and souls. You can only understand the silent dead were you to stand in their soul's stead. Douglass had a lifelong commitment to the soul, the imagination, the mind, the rich, he described it, inner life that cannot be brought down to dollars and cents. What you're looking at here, as he despised and described it, he said, I call all my life for literature, not ledgers. Now, one person in particular is very important for Frederick Douglass, and I want to spend a little bit of time talking about her. Harriet, daughter of Betts, born February 22nd, 1792, dead. My mother's personal appearance and bearing are ineffaceably stamped upon my memory. She was tall and finely proportioned. She was of deep black, glossy complexion. She had regal features and among the slaves was renowned for her manners. Death soon ended her life, a life, judging from her weary, sad, downcast countenance and her mute demeanour, full of heartfelt sorrow. The bondwoman lives as a slave and is left to die as a beast. It has been a lifelong standing grief to me that I know so little of my mother. I take few steps in life without feeling her presence, but the image is mute. And I have no striking words, no images to bring her to life for you. I learned after my mother's death that she could read and that she was the only one of all the slaves in all the vicinity who could. How she acquired that knowledge, what she paid, I know not. I am quite willing to attribute any love of letters I possess not to my often admitted and spoken about Anglo-Saxon paternity, but to the native genius of my sable, uncultivated and unprotected mother. All his life, Frederick Douglass spoke about the power of words and the power of imagery. And you'll notice he describes her as her image is mute. He also repeatedly spoke about the devastation and suffering she endured and saying, language is cold, valueless, and lifeless. Now, Mr. Douglass, as we know, in the decades of his life, was a virtuoso of the written and the oratorical word. In Edinburgh alone, in Glasgow, in Fenwick, in Galashiels, he would pack out auditoriums, churches, taverns, coffee shops, the great green land of Scotland with his voice, with his power and his words. And he persistently maintained that in telling the story of the slave, you can only ever fail. You can never speak to the silent dead. You can never bring lives to those who have died in atrocity. For Frederick Douglass, the question of family, my poor slave mother had many children but no family, was one shared by many individuals living and dying in Maryland. This exhibition brings to light and life to you the life of Frederick Douglass, born into slavery as Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, and his family, which I'll talk about as we go through. But it also tells you the stories of other freedom fighters, liberationists working in the anti-slavery campaign. Now, we have a humongously difficult job in dealing with a white supremacist academia, a white supremacist archive, and in dealing with national records that refuse to tell. As we know in the UK, we're far more interested in white abolition than we are in black radical revolutionary activism. When you look at archives, you have to deal with extreme caution because you are dealing with cautions that are committed to dehumanization, they are committed to devastation and violation of black lives enslaved and free. If you rely solely on material like this is a runaway slave advertisement. Here you see the lives of 3 individuals. I should preface, I've been showing you lots of beautiful photographs of Frederick Douglass. He himself was a newspaper man with his sons and his daughter, and he writes in the pages of the North Star, "I refuse to give you copy of figures running. You can imagine them for yourselves." What you see when you look at this document is one very famous figure in history. Minty, at the middle there, aged about 27 years, is of a chestnut color, fine looking, and about 5 feet high. For those of you who've looked at manuals selling horses, those of you who've looked at cattle records, you see the dehumanization and bestialization that's going on by that language, fine looking. Minty, living in Easton and Cambridge, which is exactly where Mr. Douglass lived as an enslaved man, is of course the heroic liberating figure of Harriet Tubman, born into slavery as Araminta Ross. And this is what she said when she made it to freedom. "I crossed the line, I was free, but there was no one to welcome me. I was a stranger in a strange land. My mother, my brother, my father, my sisters were all back in Maryland. So I made a decision. I would build a home and a life in the North, and I would go back." And go back she did. Harriet Tubman was 4'10". She suffered from narcolepsy because she put her body between a white overseer and an enslaved man to whom he was throwing a metal bar this wide, 3 feet by 2 feet. She was hit on the head with such devastating injuries that she would have spontaneous narcolepsy on her journeys. And despite that, she rescued hundreds of children, babies, and women and men. And the oldest person she rescued out of the South was 96 years old on her repeated journeys back. In the records at Maryland State, they had the ones that own the ledger that I just showed you of Mr. Douglass. They found at the bottom line here the moment when Rit, her mother, Harriet, abbreviated as Rit, an enslaved woman, when cash was paid for the midwife for a Negro Rit to the amount of $2. That was a recording of the birth of Harriet Tubman. Now, the only woman of color to have a rifle nearly as big as her in US history is Harriet Tubman. And it will be no surprise to you that this was her favorite engraving that she carried with her. She was a close personal friend of the Douglass family, and Mr. Douglass himself, who was never one to concede a superior heroic figure in many ways, he says, "You have labored in the dark, and I have labored in the light." Josiah Henson was another man born into slavery in Maryland and a powerful figure in the abolitionist and anti-slavery cause. He spoke too of the struggles facing enslaved mothers living and dying in slavery. "I was born June 15th, 1789 in Charles County, Maryland. The only incident I can remember which occurred while my mother was there was when the appearance one day of my father with his head bloody and his back lacerated. He was beside himself with rage and suffering. The overseer had brutally assaulted my mother. When my father sprang upon him like a tiger, in a minute the overseer was down. Mastered by rage, my father would have killed him were it not for the entreaties of my mother and the overseer's own promise for his safety. The overseer's promise kept as long as his life was in danger, and the day for the execution of the punishment against my father came. His head was thrust against a post, it was measured against a tack, and the member was brutally severed, leaving his ear on the post. My father was a changed man from that day. No entreaties of fear of being sold south, the worst fate facing any Maryland slave, would stop him or make him tractable. He was sold into Alabama. Neither my mother nor myself ever learned of his after fate. There's a very beautiful photograph that was taken of Josiah Henson. He's a man who came twice to the city, and in the map you'll see, and on the digital map we just launched, you'll see the very places that he spoke at, but you'll notice that this very beautiful cabinet card was made in Glasgow. Moses Roper was another man who came repeatedly to Scotland as well as the British Isles, and as Hannah Rose Murray's beautiful research powerfully shows, was a man who toured the Highlands. He was also a man who spoke about the suffering and the struggle and the pain within his own family. At last I got to my mother's home. This is a man who spent most of his life on the Rhone, and I asked her, "Do you know me?" She said no. I told her I knew her very well and thought that if she looked at me again, she would know me. She said no. This had no effect. I waited a few minutes, and then I narrated some circumstances to her. I told her about my being sold into slavery and how she, my mother, had grieved at my loss. She looked at me. Here, the mother's feelings on that dire occasion, and which only a mother can know, came to the surface. William Craft, another individual who ran for freedom, came to Edinburgh with his wife Ellen Craft, with William Wells Brown, with many more freedom fighters coming to the city to tell his story. And here he speaks of his wife, who we're going to speak about for a moment. My wife was torn from her mother's embrace in childhood. She'd seen so many children separated from their parents in this cruel manner that the mere thought of becoming a mother prevented her from marrying me. In the end, we decided it was impossible to escape from slavery in Georgia and travel 1,000 miles across the slave states. So we married and prayed and toiled until December 1848, we found a way to freedom. I suggested to my wife, Ellen Craft, that as she was so nearly white, I might get her to disguise herself as an invalid gentleman and assume the guise of my master, and I would travel as her enslaved servant. And so Dr. Walter Evans and Dr. Linda Evans have made a beautiful memorial in Savannah to their running 1,000 miles for freedom. And the powerful story is that Ellen Craft, as a powerful Georgia white slaveholder, had 3 marriage proposals, and she refused all of them. A slaveholder never appears to me so completely an agent of hell as when I think upon and look at my dear children. It is then that my feelings rise above my control. I meant to have said more with respect to my prosperity and happiness, but feelings which this recital has quickened unfit me in that direction. The grim horrors of slavery rise before me in all their ghastly terror and chill my heart and pierce my blood. Rosetta Douglass was Douglass's eldest child. She was born in 1839 and she died in 1906. When you stand in the beautiful room and see the beautiful collection owned by Dr. Walter O and Linda Evans, you see handwriting that is absolutely Mr. Douglass's, and you see someone else's handwriting. Rosetta Douglass was the intellectual inspiration, the political figure, the inspiring social consciousness of Frederick Douglass and the Douglass family. She began copy editing the North Star, his newspaper, and I'm asked so many times, how did Mr. Douglass do it? How was he an editor? How was he a business manager? How was he a political radical? How was he an unprecedented virtuosic orator writing blistering philosophical forays into social justice? He didn't do it alone. Rosetta worked with him, as did her brothers, on the North Star, his newspaper, funded by monies provided from this side of the Atlantic, from people in this very city. And at the time that she died, the time that she passed in 1906, she had gone completely blind. Throughout her whole life, she suffered repeatedly from physical and emotional eye strain as a result of proofreading and copy-editing her father's words. Now, she worked as a copy editor in the North Star, his newspaper, but she also edited his writings. Another common myth is that his second wife, a woman called Helen Pitts, a white woman, was his editor, that she was the one writing his letters for him. Now, she certainly was, but that was in 1882. Mr. Douglass's career as an intellectual, a thinker, a philosopher, as we know, begins, well, he would argue from birth, but begins in printed form in the 1830s. The person helping him for 4 decades of his life is Rosetta. Now, Rosetta understood the difficulties of memorializing the Douglass family, and she understood the invisibilization that would happen. The story of Frederick Douglass's hopes and aspirations and his longing desire for freedom has often been told. You all know it. It was a story that was made possible by the unswerving loyalty and bravery of my mother, Anna Murray. Now, we can add to that voice not only the unswerving loyalty and bravery of Anna Murray, but the unswerving loyalty and bravery of Rosetta, Charles Remond, Lewis Henry, Frederick Jr., and Annie Douglass. This question was one that pained the entire Douglass family. They understood that while they worked as a collective family business in the freedom struggle, their lives were being hidden from history. For those of you who've got excellent eyesight, you can read along. For those of you who haven't, hear the words. This is what Lewis Henry, Douglass's eldest son, has to say. And he's talking about a journalist. We can but sincerely wish that this journalist would have been able to have gone all along the line of his work, second line, from the beginning of the first day of his labors, and shown what were the distresses, anxieties, and the hardship that he and his family had to undergo in the struggle for the cause of liberty. When I spoke here in February, I spoke about Frederick Douglass and the toll that freedom took on him. Araminta Ross, Harriet Tubman, she repeatedly was asked, would she like to go and see Uncle Tom's Cabin? And she said, I have no time for that mess. I've seen the real thing. Frederick Douglass similarly said, to speak of slavery is to speak of the silent dead, which is where we began. And he repeatedly suffered from suicidal thoughts, and he repeatedly suffered from profound emotional struggle. Who did he confide in? He confided in Rosetta. My dear father, you say you are a lonely man. No one knows it better than myself and the causes. I have felt it myself for years, and I have been lonely, but I would not allow myself to analyze my feelings. I am the daughter, and I have duties to bear in that relation. Frederick Douglass's love for Rosetta was one that spanned their intellectual, emotional, and their political relationship. Rosetta is a person who wrote hundreds of letters, she wrote hundreds of essays, and she delivered numerous political speeches. She lived a life of penury, destitution, and emotional persecution. She suffered such terrifying, traumatizing persecution when she stood up for women's rights, when she stood up against capital punishment, when she stood up for women's radicalism and women's radical movements, that she increasingly wrote under a pen name. And thanks to the beautiful collection that Dr. Walter O. Evans and Linda Evans own, we know what that pen name was: Justice. While the white race have chronicled deeds of heroism and acts of mercy of the women of pioneer and other days, so we are pleased to note in the personalities of such women as Phyllis Wheatley, Sojourner Truth, and our venerable friend Harriet Tubman, sterling qualities of head, heart, and hand that hold no insignificant place in the annals of heroic womanhood. There are many more that I could name, whose strengths of character are an example to us, and they all come from the log cabins of the South. Our progress depends in the united strength of both men and women. The women alone, nor the men alone can do the work. We have to fully realize that fact and stop placing our women in the rear. This is indeed the women's era, and we are coming. At the time of her death, when she'd gone blind, Rosetta was writing a definitive history of black women's radicalism. And I always hope, and I've been giving 14 talks in the US and lots of places over the last few weeks, that someone will come up to me clutching the manuscript. You have to keep the dream alive. You have to keep it alive. This is how we found this collection. Maybe there's more. Rosetta's life was one of serious difficulty and pain, as I've emphasized, and the bond that she had with her father extended to the bond he had with his eldest son, Lewis Henry Douglass, whose beautiful daguerreotypes, photographs, and letters are in the collection across the hallway. How many days can you say that in your life? The powerful question is always intergenerational trauma. I started by showing you an atrocity document. I started by speaking of the silent dead. I started by speaking of Harriet Bailey, Rosetta's grandmother she never knew. This question of suffering and sacrifice, but of survival, is paramount in the Douglass family life. Now, Lewis Henry Douglass adheres to his father's dictate. His father stipulated that once get an eagle on your button, a musket on your shoulder, and there is no power on earth that can deny your right to citizenship. And he himself heeded his father's implication, men of color to arms. You see Douglass here unfurling his determination that he who would be free themselves must strike the blow. Douglass repeatedly said, "It is better to live free than die slaves." One very powerful story that we've decided to tell in the exhibition comes about because of the person called Gordon. Gordon was a man born into slavery in Louisiana, and despite extensive research, we've been unable to find out anything more about him. Now, Gordon comes with a very, very famous image that we have deliberately excluded from the exhibition. Mr. Douglass had a dictate that he gave to his widow on his passing, and he said, "Let there never be any kneeling, scarred, chained slaves in any of the representations of me or my legacy." What we are concealing from view here is the scarred back. Now, the scarred back was an atrocity photograph, and what it showed was this man here, who's now in his 54th Massachusetts combat uniform with his rifle, looking at you. It showed him entirely stripped, and you could see, those of you who know Toni Morrison, the scars on his back, the keloid surface of suffering and scarification on his skin. Now, this was a mass-produced carte de visite, very tiny, and it was given out to men of the 54th to galvanize them to acts of heroism. So it became a revolutionary talisman and a black call to arms. Now, those scars for Gordon were not a symbol of his objectification, as they were used by white scientists. They were his call to arms. He had attempted and successfully made it out of slavery on his 25th attempt. For Lewis Henry Douglass, as it is with all black combat soldiers, and as it is trying to begin to do justice to black combat heroism, it's a difficult job. Not only are archives hidden, distorted, and denied, they are often, in some cases, as with the French in World War I, they're deliberately burnt. With this archive, what you'll see on the right, if all we had was the National Archives in Washington, D.C., we'd have Douglass with a new first name, a new middle name, and we'd have an entirely different record about his military service than we have, thanks to the beautiful collection of Dr. Walter and Linda Evans. This is a letter that Lewis writes from the front lines, and I just want to read you a little bit of it. It's quite big, so you'll be able to probably follow along with what I'm saying. I'm starting a few lines in. Who will return? Bottom left. Who will return? Selfishness I have always tried to avoid, but I hope I may return and love the one who so dearly loves me. My dear girl, while I am away, do not fret yourself to death. I beg of you, do not. Remember that if I fall, that it is in the cause of humanity, that I am striking a blow for the welfare of the most abused and despised race on the face of the earth, that in the solution of this strife rests the question of our elevation, of our degradation, of our happiness, of our misery. Think of me often you will, but do not let your thoughts be worrying. Do not think of me in pain. Do not think of me enduring hardships. Do not think of me grappling with that non-respecter of persons' death. Think of me as aiding in the glorious work of bursting loose those chains which keep the husbands, wives, children, lovers, and friends of millions asunder, as aiding to overthrow a system, the cruelty, tyranny, and crime of which degrades millions of human beings to a level scarcely on a footing with the brutes. Think of the joy, the inexpressible joy to those millions, freed from such a foul system, and then think that I threw in my might to bring about that joy, that happiness. Then rejoice yourself that you encouraged one you held dear to help bring about this bliss. Who is he writing to? He is writing to Helen Amelia Loguen. Helen Amelia Loguen was a free woman of colour, and she was one of the daughters of Jermaine Wesley Loguen, a man who had escaped from slavery and atrocity in Tennessee, and one of Douglass's very close personal friends. In one of that letter that I just read out to you, the original is beautifully in the collection across the hallway, as is an image of Helen Amelia. And in one of the other letters that we show in those cases, he includes a beautiful postscript where he says, I did not like to say goodbye. The title of the book comes from his words. He writes to his father, if I survive, I will write you a long letter. After the war, they were married, and Helen Amelia Loguen goes on to live to be 96 years old. Now, Helen Amelia Loguen, like Rosetta, was the psychological support and comfort of her father. She was also involved in the Underground Railroad, and she was an emotional support to her father, who would often write to his daughter, and these are his words that he used, I do not feel well in my mind, but I hope to God I feel better by and by. Rosetta, too, was the one who repeatedly said to her father, do not grow despondent. She writes a beautiful letter just after Frederick Douglass passes, and she says, in the death of my beloved father, I lost my all. I lost not only a father, but he was brother, sister, and father to me. Charles Lewis Douglass also fights in the Civil War. He's Douglass's youngest son. Again, we have only a tiny document if we go to the official archive, but we now have a beautifully restored version of this gorgeous daguerreotype of Charles Raymond Douglass in his military uniform. I won't take the time to read all of this out to you, but what I do want to tell you is he's not writing to the love of his life, as Lewis Henry is writing. He's writing to his father. And his father is angry because he's heard in the newspaper that his son has stolen food. Now, Charles Raymond stands up to his father, and he writes to him and he says, I stole as you did to survive. You don't know at home, but we are dying out at camp. We are not getting the food and the nutrition like the white troops are. So he writes this beautiful letter in which he raises the consciousness of his father about the injustice that is afforded to black combat troops in the Civil War. Frederick Douglass's Men of Color to Arms is Douglass at the beginning of the black radical combat cycle. When he gets these letters from his son, he meets with Lincoln and he says, I will do no more recruiting for you until you give equal pay, equal rations, and equal protection against the Confederacy. The difficulties then in understanding the Douglass family is understanding that Lewis Henry, Frederick Jr., and Charles Raymond were all key players in the radical freedom struggle. Frederick Jr. did not fight in the front lines, but he was a radical political figure in Douglass's life, and he was heavily involved in anti-lynching campaigns, civil rights campaigns, and in radical reforms of all kinds. He was, among all the Douglass family members, the one most committed to a radical political philosophy. In Dr. Walter and Linda Evans's collection, there is a powerful, beautiful autobiography he writes in which he tells the story of the collective family's freedom struggle. He also tells of his own suffering and pain. He was a person who was married to a woman whose life was cut short by a terminal illness, and here he's writing, talking about the devastation that he experiences after her death. He's writing to the second Mrs. Douglass, and you see, "Thanks for your kind words of sympathy. While they do not heal the deep cut, they tend to lessen the pain. Virginia was my all." The question for the Douglass family is always one of understanding the legacy and the life of this family, which until this moment has been impossible to tell. Douglass himself in the post-war era took great pride and power and passion in his family's activism. He writes a letter that is also in the exhibition where he tells Lewis, "If you rise despite your persecution, you will be distinguishing yourself as all others who have done, who have risen through suffering." The question then is whose stories don't get told. And the one that I'd like to end with is that of Annie Douglass, who died at the age of 10. Annie Douglass was Douglass's light and life. She died at the age of 10, and she died at a moment in history that is never to be forgotten. Annie Douglass was the youngest Douglass child, and she was the one who sat with him when John Brown came to stay. John Brown, for those of you who don't know, was a white radical revolutionary, and he believed that slavery would only end by arming enslaved people. So he mounted Harper's Ferry raid in 1859, which many accredit as the beginning of the Civil War. Douglass hosts John Brown in his family home. Douglass is on the road, and it's Annie Douglass who sits with him, and it's her bricks that he uses to plan his subterranean passway and his military struggle. Poor Mr. Brown is dead. That hard-hearted man said he must die, and they took him in an open field and about a mile from the jail and hung him. She dies a month after this letter is written, and she dies when her father is thousands of miles away. Douglass, because of the way white supremacist organizations work, is head number one on the list of Governor Wise, who is seeking retribution for John Brown's actions. Douglass again has to fly. He goes through a steamer via Canada, and where does he come? He comes to Scotland. He gets the news, as we found as a result, and working with my wonderful PhD student Nick Batho here, we found in an undigitized newspaper, a newspaper report talking about the moment when the great man learnt the news of his youngest daughter's death. The reporter writes, "He stood up, he got up, he stopped, he got back down," repeatedly. In the archive that doesn't tell, we now have not only Annie's beautiful portrait, but we have Mr. Douglass sitting beside her. Mr. Douglass is never sitting beside any of his family members in any of the surviving portraits. Thanks to the sons, she has a grave that they carried up to Mount Hope Cemetery. Charles Raymond Douglass, in 1917, delivers a beautiful speech in which he tells us something we knew but we couldn't prove. So this manuscript is in the hallway across from us here. The original. He talks not only about the North Star, but he also tells us that Frederick Douglass, who we knew for 20 years, was on the road during the antebellum period. He's on the stump, as he said repeatedly, "Where is my chimney corner?" He was away for 10 months of the year, and this newspaper article that becomes a newspaper article, it's a speech to start out with, says, "The Underground Railroad was a family business. My mother thawed and fed the fugitives." Anna Murray Douglass was queen of the Underground Railroad in Rochester. And in terms of understanding the legacy and the importance of this document proves and puts back into history invisibilized black women's labor and invisibilized black women's struggle. You see this sentence here, where Canada was at best 40 miles away across Lake Ontario. So we now have a job to do. Frederick Douglass, we now know, not born in 1817, born in 1818, died in 1895. Rosetta Douglass, born in 1839, died in 1906. Lewis Henry Douglass, born in 1840, died in 1908. Frederick Douglass Jr., another Douglass member who died too young, born 1842, died 1892. Charles Raymond Douglass, born 1844, died 1920, and Blessed, Beautiful Annie Douglass, born 1849, died 1860. And thanks to this man on the far left, Frederick Douglass Jr., we know that she died at the age of 10 years, 11 months, and 13 days. Frederick Aaron Douglass, February 4th, 1886, died 1:40 p.m. Julia Ada Douglass, November 3rd, 1887, 11:15 p.m. Gertrude Pearl Douglass, died November 14th, 1887, 3:07 a.m. Grandfather and grandmother were by her side. Charles Frederick Douglass, died November the 2nd, 1887, 10:20 p.m. Sojourner Truth, at the moment of Civil War, asked a beautiful question. She said, "Where is Frederick Douglass's voice in this trying hour?" And as we stand in 2018 in another trying hour for white supremacy, brutality, and injustice, the question we can ask, where is Frederick Jr.? Where is Rosetta? Where is Lewis Henry? Where is Annie? Where is Charles Raymond? And thanks to this beautiful question, beautiful collection, we can answer that question. Thank you very much.